Hi everybody, welcome to week 7 and congratulations on getting that research project in. I know that was a major class event and I'm glad that it's behind you. So I'm looking forward to reading that. So this week I want to talk about chapter 7 in Studying Men and a little bit about motherhood as pathology and for her own good. I have a confession to make. In my entire life, there is one word that I stumble over. I can say polysyllabic hegemony, anything, but apocalypse, I stumble. So just so you know. But because apocalypse is what the end is what Buckbinder is talking about when it comes to masculinity. And he uses post-apocalyptic novels and writing to talk about the end of masculinity. And it's a little dense, so hopefully we can get through that. So what he's saying is basically his entire project, this book, because this is the last chapter, was to examine this crisis of masculinity or the end of masculinity. But what Buckbinder has shown us is that there's always been a crisis of masculinity, and in some ways there's always been an end to masculinity and femininity. By this, I mean, when you think about how things have changed over time, one definition or understanding of masculinity has ended and another emerged, and the same with femininity. So we wouldn't recognize the Victorian woman today as contemporary femininity. That ideal of what it meant to be a woman, that's ended. So when someone says, oh, this is the end of the man as we know it, of course, the man as we know him has ended and begun again and again and again. It's constantly developing. So, but there's been a lot of talk about the end of masculinity and the demise of masculinity, which brought with it these groups like Promise Keepers and other somewhat conservative groups trying to reclaim masculinity, and then groups like the poet Robert Bly and more politically progressive groups who link masculinity to nature and origins, history, things like that. So what he's saying then is that there's never really an end to masculinity because a new one emerges. And he talks about post-apocalyptic writing in the same way, is that at the apocalypse, it's not really the end. It's the moment of the end of something, the end of the earth, but it's a moment that illuminates, lights up, clarifies. We think of the rapture, if that's the same thing, kind of. I don't know, I'm not a Christian. But this, like, everything reveals itself. And in all post-apocalypse writing, there is a new beginning. Something exists. And so it is with the end of masculinity. One kind of masculinity ends and another emerges. And I was thinking about The Walking Dead when I was reading this, because that's kind of, to me, the after the zombie era is kind of after the crisis. So, or after the event that ended life as we know it, and then something new begins. Hopefully, when we talk about the demise of masculinity and the emergence of a new masculinity, it's more positive than zombies. But Buckbinder also tells us that this fear of the end of masculinity really began was a response to the 1960s and 70s, when so many changes happened with affirmative action and the civil rights movement, and it was a time of real turmoil and upheaval in the social order in the United States, kind of culminating with Reagan and a backlash to that, and that's when we began to, President Ronald Reagan and that conservative era, and we began to see a real fear about the demise of masculinity. So then Buckbinder moves to a model of understanding how gender practices work by looking at behavior as a field. So instead of talking about a discourse, like a discourse of gender or patriarchy as Foucault does, we would look at a football field. So if a football field is kind of the field in which we do masculinity or we do patriarchy. And remember, Buckbinder wants us to think about patriarchy not as a concrete man in charge, woman down there order, but patriarchy as a way of organizing ourselves and a way of thinking and relating. So what is a sport but a way of organizing ourselves, thinking, relating, and interacting? So we got this field of patriarchy, and some people are going to feel really at home in that field. So the captain of the football team, the person who's adept at playing, the masculine man, the white upper middle class man heterosexual is going to feel really confident, like a fish in the water. There is nothing wrong with this field. And this is gender. This is gender. This is Berger's theory that James Berger, that Buchbinder's talking about. So if we think about, think about that, like, so there are rules, and this is masculinity or patriarchy, and we all play in it, and we all perform accordingly. We all know what we're supposed to do. It's the 1950s, I'm supposed to be home baking bread, my husband did work, we all know. And we're all comfortable if we're good players. So, but then in the 60s and 70s, people outside of the field, people who weren't allowed to play, said, hey, what about me? I'm a woman too. Or this is what masculinity looks like, and began to challenge that dominant field or discourse of masculinity. And then what's emerged in these field shifts is a constant stream of different kinds of masculinities and femininities that play off and feed off of and bleed into each other. And so we get to this place where there are a multitude of ways of being masculine and feminine, and there is interplay between these ways, and they also bleed into each other. Now, much of our understanding of masculinity and femininity today, I'm still talking about Buchbinder, what we see operating kind of has threads or streams or roots back into bigger iconic ideals. And he talks about the Wild West or the cowboy, and then he says how we can still see that kind of mentality or ruggedness play out even in the suburban dad who's got an ATV or whatever they're called, and hunts on the weekend. That we just change these ideals, we modify them over time to fit contemporary culture. And then he ends, think about that. I think that's an important point. We still have these ideals, but they modify and change as contemporary culture and its economic, political, and social goals change. So page 180 at the very end, he's got that last paragraph that pretty much says what I just said about the multiple masculinities and constant change. And so this is what studying masculinities has been doing for us, showing that it's not a monolithic, this is masculinity category. And that is the end of that book. I think this is the harder book, Studying Men, so we made it through. So for her own good, we have one chapter left next week, but this week is Motherhood as Pathology. And I could go on and on about it, and I'm going to be writing about it this week, but I think that of all the things that we're seeing laid out in this book, I think this Motherhood as Pathology and the Century of the Child are still really playing out today. We have so much narrative going on about the mommy wars, women who work at home without pay, women who work out of the home for money and also work in the home for pay, without pay. There's a lot of demonizing female choices. So when we think about a woman who leaves her children, let's say just abandons them, leaves them with their father when the kids are 4 or 5, like a deadbeat dad, we might see that woman as fundamentally flawed. That's sick. That's an aberration for a woman to walk away, a mom. But men do it every day, all the time. They walk away. They're deadbeat dads, they're losers, they're not meeting their responsibilities, but they're not sick. They're usually, we don't call them sick, we don't call them, we might say they're morally corrupt and they're wrong, but they're not sick or demented. But a woman who leaves her children is somewhat crazy. And I think the other thing with motherhood as pathology is that unless you're just right, Winnicott, there's a child psychologist, David Winnicott, who talks about good enough mothering, that all a child needs is good enough mothering. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be the best, but just good enough to meet that child's basic needs. And I like that. I like that theory. But it still tells us that there is a certain quality, a mercurial quality. What constitutes good enough mothering? How do we know we are administering this good enough mothering to our children? And I think whenever mothers veer into excess, helicopter parents, soccer mom, hockey mom, however we categorize these things, whenever we veer into what's seen as excess, we're somehow less than human, sick, wrong, pathologized. And I would just challenge you to think about that and those images of motherhood that we see. I even, even the shows on teen pregnancy, why aren't we doing these on the fathers? What is life as a teen father? We just continue to position motherhood in a place that almost deifies maternity, and nothing is greater than having children. It's the first thing people ask of one another, particularly women, getting to know each other. Do you have children? And there's that bond. And so on one hand, there's nothing better than having children, and people say, can you imagine your life without your children, etc. But on the other hand, mothers are constantly taken to task for what they do to or fail to do to or with or for their children. And we tend to see eating disorders, depression, cutting, psychological problems as somehow a failure of parenting and generally a failure of mothering. So Ehrenreich and English are setting the groundwork for this. Okay, that's it for week 7, and I will see you next week for our last video. Thanks and have a good week.